1898. In the Missouri Ozarks, the horrible story of the Vancroft sisters was whispered. They had become their father's lovers, a farmhouse with shuttered windows, a respected man who bought sedatives, and quicklime. 2 daughters, struck from the church ledger, their names crossed out. Then, a letter, hidden for decades, surfaced with just a few lines of ink. This is how a family's secret finally broke through the stone wall of silence. But if the law came too late, and the man was already in his grave, could the truth itself become the executioner? We invite you to comment with your location and local time. We're interested to see where these accounts reach. If bringing truth to light matters, subscribe to stand with us. The record begins not with a shout, but with the quiet scratch of a pen. In a tattered church ledger from 1898, 2 names are struck through with a firm black line of ink: Ellis and Margaret Vancroft. In the margin, a clerk's careful hand has added a short, damning note. It does not explain what they did, only what they were. The note reads, "Conduct not fit for daughters." For years, that was the only official word. The Vancroft sisters were simply gone from the community rolls. But in a town where every family was known, a silence that loud always finds a voice. It found one in Martha Hensley, the steadfast Sunday school teacher. She remembered the girls. She recalled their pale faces, the way they would stand too close together, as if shielding each other from an unseen wind. Their absences from class became more frequent, always excused by their father, Joseph Vancroft, a respected landholder with a grip like iron and a Sunday smile that never quite reached his eyes. Martha noticed the girls were never among friends their own age. They were always with him. At the general store, in the wagon, on the farm, always under his shadow. Soon, the whispers started. The kind of talk that passes over fence posts and at sewing circles. At first it was dismissed as idle gossip. People said the sisters were unnaturally close to their father. But such talk was ugly, and Joseph Vancroft was a man of means. To accuse him was to risk his quiet wrath. So the whispers faded, but the watching did not. The talk might have died completely, if not for the event that followed. One spring, Ellis Vancroft, the elder sister, delivered a child. There was no husband, no suitor known to the town. When the baby was brought for baptism, the registry was filled out in near silence. And under the line for the father's name, the pen never touched the page. The space was left empty. Suddenly, the old rumors no longer felt like gossip. They hardened into a terrible, unspoken certainty. The crossed-out names in the ledger, the girl's frightened eyes, the child with no father. The truth began to form a shape, a monstrous shadow that fell over the friendly white farmhouse on the edge of town. It wasn't just impropriety. It was an abomination, a secret kept behind a locked door and a father's watchful gaze. The Vancroft farmhouse stood apart from the others, set back from the road on a rise of land that seemed to discourage visitors. After the whispers about Ellis's child began, the house seemed to pull further into itself. The windows were shuttered more often than not. The porch swing hung still. To the outside world, it was just a quiet family keeping to themselves. But inside those walls, the silence was being carefully manufactured. The proof of this was not in what people saw, but in what was written down on paper, filed away in the dusty ledgers of the town. At the feed store, Joseph Vancroft's account showed purchases that were unusual for a farmer. He bought tonics and sedatives, items one might use for a chronically ill patient. But he also bought quicklime, and in quantities far greater than needed for any agricultural purpose. Around that same time, a neighbor who lived downwind of the Vancroft property recalled a sour chemical smell that would sometimes rise from the farm, strongest near the root cellar. He thought little of it then. It was just another strange odor in a country full of them. Weather records from that year confirm it was a harsh, unforgiving winter. Snow came early and stayed late, sealing the Ozark hollows in a blanket of white. The Vancrofts, like many, kept to their own land, but their isolation felt different. It felt absolute. A young farmhand, hired for the spring planting, later spoke of it. He remembered seeing Margaret, the younger sister, watching him from an upstairs window. One afternoon he found the side door locked when he went to fetch water. Joseph told him Margaret was ailing and needed her rest undisturbed. The farmhand noted the key turning in the lock from the outside. That same season, the old-school logs show that Ellis Vancroft, then in her mid-teens, was withdrawn. No reason was given. One day she was on the roster, the next she was not. It was a quiet erasure. Perhaps the most chilling account came from a collection of letters found many years later, written by a cousin who had paid a brief visit. She wrote to her mother of the Vancroft house as a place of uneasy quiet. She mentioned hearing strange nightly music from behind her uncle's closed door, a sorrowful humming sound with no clear source. She also wrote of doors in the upstairs hallway that would not open, even when she was sure someone was on the other side. The dread was no longer a whisper, it was a pattern. The sedatives, the lime, the locked rooms, the girls vanishing from public life one by one. This was not a family in mourning or sickness, this was a prison. And the evidence suggested the lives of the Vancroft sisters were being systematically controlled, silenced, and bent to their father's terrible will. The whispers in the town were one thing, but the secrets kept by women were another. For every suspicion spoken over a fence, there was a truth recorded in private, hidden from the light. The first of these truths came from the diary of Sarah Dilling, the town midwife. She was a steady, discreet woman who had brought half the county's children into the world. Decades after her death, a single, folded page was found tucked inside an old medical text. The entry, written in a hurried but clear hand, detailed the night she was summoned to the Vancroft farm. It was a secret birth. Ellis was the mother. But Sarah's notes focused on the father, Joseph. He was there, in the room, his presence described as too near, too watchful. A grandfather might be anxious, but this was different. He was a guard. The midwife's most haunting observation was of the child itself, a frail, quiet infant. She wrote that it was not right in the eyes, a vague but deeply unsettling description that spoke of a wrongness that went deeper than simple illness. Sarah Dilling never took this record to the law. Her fear was twofold. She feared Joseph's temper, a cold, quiet anger that promised consequences, but she also feared the church and the town itself. In a later hushed conversation with a neighbor, she admitted what she truly believed, that Joseph Vancroft himself had sired the child. But to speak such a thing aloud was to invite ruin. And so her diary page remained hidden. The silence held. It would take another generation, and the chance discovery of a small wooden box for the second, more damning truth to surface. Inside was a letter, never sent, written by the younger sister, Margaret. It was written to a confidant who had moved away, a desperate cry into the void. In her looping, youthful script, she confirmed the town's darkest fear. The line that changed everything was just a few words, a confession that was not hers to make. She wrote, "Papa says we are his brides. God forgive us." Here it was, the unimpeachable testimony of the victim, a direct confession from inside the shuttered farmhouse. And yet, no charges were ever filed. The letter was found too late. The whispers had been too quiet. Joseph Vancroft continued his life as a respected man of property and faith. His reputation, protected by the fear and silence of an entire community, was a fortress. It seemed the predator would escape untouched, his crimes buried with his victims, cloaked in the thick blanket of rural isolation and the town's determined hush. Silence can hold for a lifetime, but it rarely survives the grave. Nearly 20 years passed. The year was 1917. The world was at war, and the old secrets of a small Ozark town seemed smaller than ever. But inside the Vancroft farmhouse, time had only deepened the rot. Ellis, the elder sister, was now a gaunt, broken woman, worn down by sickness and a grief that had no name. A visiting nurse, a woman named Clara Fielding, was sent to tend to her. Clara was known for her kindness, but also for her sharp eyes. She was a woman who listened. And in the dim light of the sick room, Ellis finally spoke. The confession came out in a feverish whisper, the words she had held inside for 2 decades. "He claimed us both," she told the nurse, "and the children were his." It was the plural that struck Clara. Children. More than one. Clara was methodical. She began to ask quiet questions around town, pulling on the threads of old gossip. She went to the county records office, spending hours hunched over dusty census logs and burial records. The pattern that emerged was horrifying. She found records of at least 2 unexplained infant deaths on the Vancroft farm over the years, infants whose lives were so short they were never properly counted, never fully acknowledged. In the town cemetery, there were small, unmarked stones in the family plot. Crude headstones weathered by the years that read only one word: baby. There was no surname, no date, as if these children were erased before they were ever truly there. Clara Fielding did something the midwife, Sarah Dilling, had been too afraid to do. She spoke. She did not go to the law. She knew a sick woman's word against a powerful man was a losing battle. Instead, she went to a place where a man's reputation was weighed and measured every day, the local Veterans Hall. She spoke to a man who had known Joseph Vancroft for 40 years, a man whose opinion carried weight. The account spread like fire in dry grass. The old whispers, long dormant, grew into a roar of indignation. Families who had long suspected something unholy at the Vancroft place finally felt emboldened to speak its name. The community's suspicion, once a private shame, became a public anger. The law was finally forced to take notice. But justice, when it moves so slowly, is often cheated. Before the sheriff could even draw up a warrant, word came from the Vancroft farm. Joseph had been taken by a sudden stroke. He died in his own bed, untouched by the law. For a moment it seemed he had won. He had eluded earthly judgment. His secrets would go with him to the grave. But the truth, once freed, has a life of its own. Joseph Vancroft was dead, but the story was very much alive. The whispers had grown into declarations, and the truth would not be buried with him. Joseph Vancroft was in the ground, but his story was not over. The law had failed to put him in a cell, so the community decided to put him in a prison of a different kind, the prison of memory. After his death, as his few remaining possessions were being cleared from the farmhouse, one last piece of testimony was found. It was a small wooden box containing a stack of Ellis's drawings, sketches she had made over the years on scraps of paper and the backs of old receipts. There were no words, but the images spoke with a clarity that no confession ever could. There were drawings of doors with heavy bolts on the outside, sketches of a tall, shadowed man with no face, who stood in every room. And the most heartbreaking of all, drawings of a cradle, always seen from a distance, with no mother beside it, as if the artist herself was not allowed near. These simple, haunting pictures were the final, silent proof of a life lived in captivity. They were passed from hand to hand, sealing the town's judgment. The first official act of this new reckoning came from the place where the silence began, the church. The elders convened, and with a solemn finality, they reopened the ledger from 1898. Beside the names of Ellis and Margaret, where they had been struck out, a new entry was made for their father. Next to Joseph Vancroft's name, the clerk wrote the official correction: stricken for abomination. The man who had used his standing in the church as a shield was now cast out, his sin named for all time. This was not the end of his punishment. In that town a man's name was his legacy. Joseph's became a curse. When people spoke of him, they did so with shame and disgust. His land, once a symbol of his power, was sold off at a fraction of its worth, as if the soil itself was tainted. And when the time came to mark his final resting place, the community made a choice. They left his grave unmarked. No stone, no name, just a plot of earth that would slowly be forgotten. He was erased. Though the courts of men never touched him, the justice of memory was absolute and eternal. His reputation was shattered. His daughters, once shunned and whispered about as sinners, were now remembered for what they were, victims who had endured the unthinkable. And for generations that followed, his name was not buried with him. It was kept alive as a warning, a story told on cold nights to remind everyone that even when the law is slow and justice seems lost, the truth will find its voice. The Ozark Hills had kept his secret for years, But the land remembers, and in the end, the predator was unmasked.